Hello, it's good to be back at the World Storytelling Cafe. I've been asked if I'd like to do some more stories, and if you know a storyteller, they rarely refuse to tell a story. I've got my new frame drum here that I'm learning to play, and I thought it looked a bit like the moon that we have in the sky at the moment. So I'm a beginner at learning the frame drum, and I actually wanted to tell a story that I've never told to the public before. In fact, it's a story that I only heard within the last couple of weeks. My good friend John Rowe, I remember him saying to me, the best way to learn a story is to tell the story. And I couldn't agree more. It's always a bit of a risk when it's a first story, first airing. I got the story from a podcast. I was listening to Amy Douglas interviewing Helen East, and they were talking about their both of their experiences with Duncan Williamson, who seems to be in the news more and more and more with regard to storytelling. There seems to be a bit of a renaissance, which for me, relatively new to Duncan Williamson stories. It's a wonderful thing as far as I'm concerned. I just adore his stories. This is a story that's rarely heard or told, apparently, and Amy gave me permission to tell this story. I heard just the bones of it, so I've put some flesh on it. I'm sure it needs a bit of polishing and shining and what have we, but hey, I'm not going to let that stop me telling a story that I think that needs to be told. Long, long, long ago, there was a laird who owned a huge tract of land. So much land, well, at least in his lifetime, he wouldn't be able to walk all that land. Too much land, in my opinion, for one person. And he certainly didn't know all those parts of the land. He had men come on to take deer, shoot deer. He had men come and take various other things from off the land, fish salmon and what have we. But he didn't really know all the bounty and beauty that his own land had. But the travelling families that passed through that land, they knew of the other riches of the land, of what it offered. And there was a family that often went through this estate, avoiding the gamekeepers and the laird himself, to be sure if they saw the travellers going through, they would see it that they were off the land as fast as they could possibly get them off the land. This travelling family, well, it was a mother and father and a handful of boys that they had. And as these boys grew up, well, mother and father taught them all the ways of the countryside and of the sea and the rivers, it has to be said. But many of the ways of the countryside and how to look after the countryside. If they cut some hazel to make their benders, father would show them, only take a few, leave the rest. Over the years, they will replenish and regrow for other families that pass through here. Leave the site where we are clean and tidy as they did. And they would move their wagon and horses from one place to another, using whatever they could, eating and foraging from the countryside, the herbs and the plants and the nuts, and catching a little fish here and there, and maybe snaring a rabbit and other bits and pieces as they went along. And they only ever took what they needed. And this was father and mother's philosophy that they passed on to their boys. Only ever take what you need. Don't take too much. Leave enough for the next family that passes through. As is the culture. And, well, boys being boys, well, as they got a bit older, they began to compete with each other. You know what teenage boys are like. There was only a year apart from each lad, and they began to compete with each other. They wanted to prove who was stronger than the other one, who could throw a stone further than another one, who could snare a rabbit quicker than the other, etc., etc. Who could catch a fish this big? No, it was this big. No, it was this. No, mine was this big. You know how it is with young boys, how they begin to compete as they get into adolescence. That's certainly my experience. Well, the boys began to compete a bit more, and father would remind them, about looking after the land and not taking more than you needed. And he could see that the boys were probably going to need a lesson. Well, they knew of a little inlet from the sea where the sea came in and formed the river. And as the water went through, it went from salty to river, sweet, clean river water. And the salmon would come through. And if you hit it at the right time of year, well, there was plenty for everybody to eat. The laird didn't know of this place. The gamekeeper didn't know of this place. But the travellers, they did. And this secret bit of information they would pass on from one family to another. And it was always a source of food for certain times of the year for them. A good source of food. Well, father thought it's time the boys knew of this place. So they set up a little camp discreetly. And the boys could see the inlet, the river. They could see the salmon beginning to run. They were coming back inland from the sea, that return journey that they make, and there were lots of them. There were lots and lots and lots of salmon swimming up this river, and the boys were so excited. They couldn't believe. They thought, well, this is going to be amazing. Well, they began to fish with a rod and a hook and line to start with, but there were so many salmon. Well, they could get in the water and catch them with their hands, which is what they began to do to compete with each other. And many of the salmon dodged and slipped and slid and got past them. But every now and again, one of the boys would grab a salmon and get it out and just do away with it, kind of thing, just bop on the head with the old priest. And they began to compete, of course. Well, it ended up, father watched. He knew what was going to happen. And he thought, well, it's time the boys learnt their lesson. And the boys were all in the river by this stage. It was a warm day. They were splashing and having a bit of fun, and they were catching salmon as and when they could. And they began to take more than they needed. And father said to them, be sure you don't take more than you need. Well, adolescent boys being adolescent boys, they ignored their father. They were getting carried away in the moment with competing each other, and they ignored their father. And father and mother just waited, for they knew what was going to happen. And as the boys were in there trying to catch more and more salmon, more than they needed, they already had enough on the bank, they were still catching more. Well, they felt the rumbling before they saw anything. The river began to shudder and shimmer, and the waves began to come up that river from out of the sea. And before they knew it, a huge salmon came swimming up the river, the largest salmon they'd ever seen, the size of a whale, with a mouth full of teeth and eyes of red, and it came roaring up that river. And the boys were absolutely terrified, and they jumped out of that river and got out the way. And then as soon as it had come, well, it disappeared. And father thought, well, hopefully that's their lesson. Well, that evening, they made their fire, they kindled their fire and got a fire going, and they sat around and they cooked some of that salmon. And they sat and they had some herbs and what have we with it, a few potatoes. And they sat and they were eating and they were talking about the day and the fish, that giant salmon that came up the inlet from out of the sea. And father said to them, that's the devil salmon. He knows when you are taking too much. Nature knows when you are taking too much, and nature will always show you when you are taking too much. My boys, let that be a lesson to you. And so the boys learnt that day the consequences of if they take too much. And that's the end of my story. And as I say, it's a new story. It's a story that's going to grow on me, I'm sure. I love it. I hope you enjoyed it. Rough spots and everything. Thank you for that. And now I'm going to think about my next story. Long, long, long ago, there was a boy that lived with his father. His mother had passed away many years before. Father sat him down one day and said, "My son, one day you will be old enough, you will have to venture out into the world on your own and make your own way in life. Until that day, I want you to learn what you can learn from me. Learn what you can learn from nature. Observe and learn. And then you will have all that you need for when that day comes." "Yes, father," said the boy, not really fully understanding what father meant. But anyway, the boy was a quick learner and he loved to watch his father and learn all that he could from his dad. He would go out into the wood, into the forest, and he would observe the animals and learn many, many things, many, many things. And the months and the years went past in quite a happy life. Things were tough, they were not rich, but he had the richness of the nature around him and the kindness of his father. One day, when the boy was much older, his father said, "Son, please sit down." And the boy sat at the little table that they had. There was only 2 chairs, and he sat down. And the father said, "My son, it is time for you to leave. It is time for you to find your way in the world. But before you go, I wish to give you some things to take with you." And the father turned round and he went to the wall of the fireplace and he took off a sword that had always been up there. And the boy had always wondered and looked and wondered about this sword. And father said, "This sword was given to me by my father. It was given to him by his father, and his father, and his father, and his father, as far back as we know. This is the family's sword. It will protect you. It will look after you. Take this." And then father went and got a loaf of bread out of the pantry and put a loaf out of the larder and put a loaf down on the table. And let me tell you, if you had a whole loaf of bread in those times, consider yourself to be rich. These were tough times. And the boy acknowledged the loaf of bread. And then his father got a sackcloth and put that on the table and said, "Son, this is all you will need." The boy put the loaf of bread in the sack and he put the sword through his belt. He stood up, he hugged and kissed his father goodbye, and he left. Well, he walked and he walked and he walked. He walked over hills and down dales, through valleys, along rivers, through woods and forests, over mountains, and on he walked. One day he was walking and he heard a commotion, an argument. And he hid behind a tree and he had a little look to see what he could see. And there in the distance, not so far away, he could see a lion arguing. So he crept a bit closer, and then he noticed the lion was arguing with a falcon who was arguing with an ant. And the 3 of them were arguing with each other. And then the boy noticed that there was a dead horse at their feet. The lion looked up and saw the boy. "Boy," said the lion, for he could speak. "Boy, come here, come here." And the boy looked around and the lion said, "Yes, you. Don't be afraid. Come here, boy." And the boy nervously went over to where the lion, the falcon and the ant were. The lion said, "We need your help. We have found this dead horse. There is lots of fresh meat on it to eat, but we can't decide how to divide it. What do you suggest?" And the boy said, "Well, lion, you are a large creature. You must have the largest portion of the horse. Falcon, you have a delicate stomach, so you can have the liver, the lights, the hearts, the kidneys, and what have we from inside. And ant, I think you should have the horse's head. For on the head, in all those little nooks and crannies, there will be meat for you to eat." Well, the lion, the falcon and the ant thought this was a good suggestion. Well, I think you've solved it, said the lion. Thank you. We must give you a gift of some description. And the boy said, I have everything that I need. I don't need anything. And the lion said, but I insist. We want to give you something. Please accept a gift. And the boy, well, he was polite. And he said, well, okay, just a little something perhaps. And the lion looked at the boy in his eyes and said, I want to give you the courage of a lion, the heart of a lion, whenever you need it. The falcon stepped forward and said, I want to give you the ability of flight whenever you need it. And the ant stepped forward and said, I want to give you the ability to shrink to the size of an ant whenever you need it. Well, the boy wasn't sure about the ant idea, but he was polite and he thanked them and he bid them farewell and off he went on his journey. Well, he was walking for a while and, well, I don't know about you, but if someone told me that I could fly like a falcon, I would want to try. Are you like that? Are you? I think yes, most of you are saying that you would like to fly like a falcon if you had that power. Well, this boy was like you. He stopped and he just imagined himself as a falcon and he took off and he soared high up into the sky, and there he hovered, surveying everything below him. He could see everything. And he was looking around as falcons do with that wonderful vision that they have. And in the distance, he saw a castle. So he flew towards the castle. And at one end of the castle, there was a tower and there was a beautiful big tree beside the tower. And he landed on a branch. Inside the tower was a princess. She was locked in there. I don't think it was isolation, the type that we have at the moment, but it was a form of isolation. She was locked in there for her own safety. She saw the bird. She went across to the window and she opened the window and she offered her arm, and the falcon just hopped onto her arm. And she went into her room and she actually had a bird's cage, and she opened the door and the falcon happily hopped into the cage and she closed the cage. And there the falcon sat quite happily. Well, the princess rather was brought her meal a bit later in the day, and she ate her meal and she did a bit of sewing and what have we. And then it was her bedtime and she took herself to bed and she fell asleep quite soon. Well, the falcon in the cage, well, he turned into an ant and he crept in between those bars, down the stem of the cage, across the room. He became the boy. He sat down in the chair beside the princess and he leant forward and he woke her up and she screamed, "Ah, there's a troll in my room, there's a troll in my room." Well, the king, her father, heard this. He came running down the corridor. He unlocked the door and he got into the room. Well, by this time, the falcon was back in the cage. And he came in and he said, "What is it? What is it?" She said, "There's a troll in the room, there's a troll in the room." Well, he looked behind the curtains and he couldn't see anything. He looked underneath the bed. He couldn't see anything. He looked in the cupboard. He couldn't see anything. He said, "There's nothing in the room, my dear. You're just having a bad dream. Now go back to sleep." And the princess laid herself back down and the king locked her back in that tower and off he went. Well, the princess was soon asleep and the falcon turned into an ant once again, crept between the bars, down the stem, across the floor. When he got to the chair, he became the boy and he sat down and he leant forward and he woke up the princess again. "Ah, he's back in the room. The troll is in the room. The troll is in the room." Well, she could hear the king come running down. He came, unlocked the door. The falcon was back in the cage. He burst into the room. "Where is it? Where is it?" She said, "It's in the room somewhere. It's in the room somewhere." Well, he looked behind the curtains. There was nothing there. He looked underneath the bed. There was nothing there. He looked in the cupboard. "There is nothing here, my dear," he said. "You are just having a bad dream. You are having a nightmare. Now, will you go to sleep?" And the king locked her back in the room. Well, it took the princess a little bit longer to fall asleep. but she eventually fell asleep once again. And the falcon, he turned back into an ant. He crept between the bars, down the stem, across the floor, became the boy. He was about to lean forward to wake her up. He thought, oh. And then he whispered, Princess, Princess, wake up, wake up. And she opened her eyes. He said, don't scream, don't scream. And she looked at him and she said, who are you? And he said, I'm just a boy finding my way in the world. Why are you locked in this tower? Oh, she sat up. Let me tell you, she said. There is a 9-headed ogre that lives in the mountains. He has already taken my 2 sisters. My father doesn't want me to be the third. I don't want to be the third one either. And we have to feed his dragon all manner of, we have to give him cows and sheep to take to the ogre, the 9-headed dragon. He visits us once a week to collect whatever meat that we give him. And I'm not allowed out for my own protection. Oh, said the boy. Well, I'll fight the dragon. But you're just a boy, she said. But I will fight the dragon. Ask your father to come. Tell him, I will tell him. So the princess called for her father, and the king came along, and she explained, and the king said, you, boy, you'd fight the 9-headed dragon? Have you any idea how fierce this animal is? It's got 9 heads, I tell you. It's 9 heads. It breathes fire. It's an evil, vicious dragon. And you'll fight it? Indeed I will. I will fight it. I will defeat it. Oh dear. Well, I don't know you. Nothing can be lost if the dragon defeats you. Okay. So it was agreed the next time the dragon came that the boy could take on the dragon. Well, the boy put his sword in his belt and he stepped out into the courtyard and he waited for the dragon. The dragon came swooping out of the sky into that courtyard, and the boy drew his sword, and with the heart and the courage of a lion, he took on that dragon and he sliced off one head immediately. The dragon reared and breathed fire at the boy. The boy dodged and cut off the second head. And on they fought. You could hear metal clattering on stone. You could hear the claws of the dragon scratching on the flagstones of the castle floor as they rolled and tumbled and fought. And he took off a third head, and on they fought, and the dragon shot fire at him, and his teeth, and he gnashed and he clawed at the boy, and the boy took off a fourth head, and on he went, taking off heads until there was one head left on the dragon. The largest head you'd ever seen, full of evil, sharp teeth, breathing and snorting fire, and he ripped and roared at the boy, and the boy deftly dodged and took off the last head, and the dragon lay there, dead. Heads, blood and guts everywhere. The king looked at his daughter and said, my, oh my, what an incredible young man. I think when the time is right, he might make a good husband for you. In the meantime, he is to be your personal guard. I will let you out of the tower. I will unlock it. You can now come out and go about your daily deeds as you wish, with this young man being your guard. Well, the princess was delighted at this. And the boy, well, he would escort her everywhere. They would go into the rose garden and they would pick roses for each other and smell those roses. He would read her bits of poetry. She would read him bits of poetry. They were beginning to fall in love. Yeah, love. One day, they were walking through the gardens, as I say, picking and sniffing the odd flower and looking at the butterflies fluttering around and just having a lovely time. When suddenly, the 9-headed troll himself came leaping into the garden. He grabbed hold of the princess, and with his long legs, he leapt out of the castle, and he was gone with the princess. The boy looked, ran to the king. He said, King, the 9-headed troll himself has come in and he's taken the princess. And the king looked at the boy and said, don't just stand here, get after them. Well, the boy thought for a second, and then he thought, falcon. And he became a falcon. And he took off and he soared high up into the sky, and he looked all about him. But that troll had long legs, and he ran fast, and he was gone. Well, the falcon surveyed all the landscape, was looking and looking and looking, and he was drawn to an island that he saw lower down, and he went down onto that island, and he landed, and he became the boy. And there was something about this island, this rocky island with a few trees and bits and pieces, and he began to walk around the island. However, he kept being drawn back to this huge rock at the base of a small mountain. And there was a split in the rock. And he knew he was to be in there. But how to get in there? He thought, how can I get in there? And then he thought, become an ant. That's right. Thank you. Yes, become an ant, he thought. Yes, become an ant. And he snuck into that crack, and he went down and down and down to a long, dark, dank corridor. There were cobwebs hanging everywhere. There was the odd dead upturned woodlouse just laying there, and he went through and through and through and down more steps, deeper and deeper, along another dank, damp, dark corridor. There were more cobwebs. There were dead spiders with all 8 legs just up in the sky, just up in the air. They're dead. And he snuck past those, did the ant. And he went along to the end of the corridor, and there he came across an oak door. Well, being an ant, he couldn't get up to unlock the door, so he thought, I'll crawl underneath. And he crawled underneath that door, and when he did, oh my gosh, there was a 3-headed troll. And there was one of the princess's sisters, one of the other princesses, and she was combing the hair on the 3 heads of the troll. She was delousing him, getting all the nits and lice out of his hair. Well, the ant crept through that room and along another corridor until he came to a second oak door, which was closed. So he crept underneath that, and he looked. A 6-headed troll, even larger than the one before, with 6 heads. And there was the other princess, the other sister. And she was doing the same. She was combing and delicing the hair on the head of the 6-headed troll. And he went through that room to the end of the corridor, where there was a 3rd oak door. And he crept underneath that. The largest troll he'd ever seen in his life. 9 heads. And there was his princess. And she was doing the same as her sister. She was delousing and getting the nits out of the hair on the 9 heads of the troll. Well, the ant crept across the floor and went onto her foot and just nipped at her ankle. And she knew who it was. She excused herself from the troll, and she went outside the room. And the ant became the boy, and the boy said, Princess, have you asked the troll if he'll ever release you? No, I haven't. Have you ever asked him if he'll ever let you see your father again? No, I haven't. Ask him. You must ask him those questions. And the boy shrank and became the ant again, back onto her foot. And she went back into the room. She picked up her comb, and she continued to comb the hair on the 9-headed troll. Do you think you'll ever release me? She asked. Ha, 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 ha. Release you? No. Do you think you'll ever let me see my father ever again? See your father ever again? Ha, 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 ha. No. There is a way, ha, ha, said the troll, but no one knows the way. Ha, ha. You are locked in here forever. I'll tell you the way, but no one knows the way, but I'll tell you. I have a 9-headed dragon. He is fierce. If someone could defeat him and cut off his heads and cut off his largest head and get to that large head and open its mouth and lift up its tongue, there would be a tiny grain of sand in there. If they could find that tiny grain of sand and bring it back here and drop it in the split in the rock above our heads, all us trolls would be gone instantly. The ant heard all of this. The ant left her foot, went underneath the door, along the corridor, back through the second room where the princess was still combing the six-headed troll's hair. Through the last room, the other princess was combing the hair on the three-headed troll. Out through that split in the rock, and he immediately became the falcon, and he flew off, and he went back to the castle as fast as he possibly could. Well, when he got back there, the dragon, well, he hadn't been cleaned up. The dragon's body and its heads and its blood and its guts were still everywhere. The cleaners hadn't been in. I did hear that they changed contracts after that. But anyway, the dragon was still there. And the boy, well, he went up to the largest head and he opened its mouth. And there was a mouthful of those sharp, sharp teeth. And he lifted up that tongue. And underneath was a tiny grain of sand. And he picked it up. And he put it into his mouth. And he immediately became the falcon. And he took off. And he soared and soared and soared across to get back as fast as he could. But nightfall came. And he couldn't find his way. And he was exhausted. And he needed to rest. So he came down and down and down and down. And in the dark, the black dark of night, he fell asleep. He awoke the next morning as the boy. And he looked and he could hear the sea coming in and out. And he looked around him. He was on a beach. Oh no, the grain of sand. Oh, and I'm on a beach. Well, all day he spent walking up and down and up and down and up and down this beach to find this grain of sand. The sun went down. He couldn't find the grain of sand. He needed to sleep. He slept through the night. He woke the next morning to the sound of the sea and the sun was rising, and he got up as early as he possibly could, and he walked that beach up and down and up and down and up and down looking for that grain of sand, and still he couldn't find that grain of sand. The sun went down, the night came in, and once again exhausted he fell asleep. The third morning he got up, the same thing, searching and searching and searching. The sun went down, the moon began to rise. He carried on looking through the night, through the silvery light of the sun, up and down and up and down and up and down that beach, looking and looking and looking, and the grain of sand. I found the grain of sand, the grain of sand. He put it into his mouth. He became a falcon once again, and he took off and he flew as he possibly could. And when he arrived, he landed, he became the boy. He took the grain of sand out of his mouth and he dropped it in that crack. And as soon as he did, the three trolls shattered into thousands of pieces, and they were no more. And then the rock itself began to creak and groan and groan and creak and split and split and split open wider and wider and wider, and suddenly a golden palace began to grow out of that space between those rocks, up and up and up. And then the three princesses, the three sisters themselves, came walking out, while the boy, who was now a man, joined them. And they all walked back to the castle of the king, their father. And the king, when he saw his three daughters, he did rejoice. And he said to the young boy, who was now a young man, "You would make a fine husband for my daughter. So be it that you are married." For the daughter, the princess, she wanted to marry him too. And they were married the very next day, and they had the biggest party that you could ever imagine. And had you lived in those times, well, you would have been invited to the table to share in the party and the food and the wine and the ale. And they had a wonderful party. And the couple, well, they went to live in that golden palace. And they had many children and a good life. And of course, they lived happily ever after. Thank you. I'm just going to have a sip of water just to soothe my throat. Check on the time and think about what story to tell you. Uh, I think I'd like to tell you a real life story, actually, about the roots of my name, my surname, Ibbs, Ibbs. Ibbs is a very unusual surname indeed. And as children, when we grew up, we would ask our father where our name came from, and he didn't really know. He died when I was relatively young, but he didn't really know, and no one really knew in the family where the name really came from. So I did some family tree research many years ago in the mid-90s, and discovered family going way back. And the earliest relative I could find with my name, my surname, was a Faith Ibbs from 1599, registered in the church register, 1599, Faith Ibbs. And well, it was wonderful to discover. And a little bit after that, myself and my brother, we discovered a place called St. Hippolytus on the Bedfordshire-Hertfordshire border. And we somehow the name was linked to that in some way. I can't recall quite now. But we went along to have a look. And while we were bowled over by what we found a street just alongside the village kind of thing, just offset from the village slightly. And it was each house, there were 6 large houses, and each house was called St. Ibbs. And we realised that there was this place called St. Ibbs. Now, I'm aware that people took their names from local things years ago, and we wonder if Faith was probably a servant in one of the big houses and she took the name Ibbs as her surname. Who knows? Anyway, as I say, the family have lived the Bedfordshire, Hertfordshire way over the 16th, 17th, 1800s, and we tracked a lot of that. And we discovered a family story that I want to share with you from my great grandfather, I believe it is. First thing you need to know actually about us Ibbs is we're very adaptable. We don't give up easily on things. We're very tenacious. Very creative, make something out of nothing kind of thing, and we don't panic in a crisis. But anyway, I digress. Well, this great grandfather of mine, John Joseph, he had 8 children. I come from a family of 6 children, and he had 8 children, and it was one particularly harsh winter. So the story goes. Times were poor. They were just land workers, very poor time, and they ran out of food and money, and there was nothing, and they were struggling. And he was a very proud man, and he didn't want to go begging, and he wondered what to do. And he said, I've got to go and try and find something, my love, to his wife. And she said, John, whatever you do, don't come back without fish, fur or fowl. You must bring something back for the children. I'll do my best, he said. And off he went. Well, he went to the local vicar. I'm not sure how much of a God-fearing man he was, but he went to the local vicar and knocked on the door, and the vicar came to the door. Hello, Mr. Ibbs, he said. And he explained his situation, and he said, I don't want charity from you, but do you have an idea of how I could find food for my family? I believe I have just the thing for you, said the vicar. And he invited him in, and he said, I have an old musket here. He took the old musket down. He said, I think you could shoot this and probably shoot yourself something. Just let me show you how it works. And he got some gunpowder, and he put some gunpowder in, and he got a little bit of wadding cloth, and he put that in, and he took the ramrod from underneath the barrel, and he rammed that in. And then he put his hand in his pocket to feel his balls, the lead balls that he had in his pocket. And he dropped them into the barrel, and he ramrodded it in, and he said to Mr. Ibbs, he said, whatever you do, make sure you take the ramrod out. Just put it back in its slot underneath the barrel. Then come outside. And they went outside, and he fired it. He said, do you think you could do that? And John said, yeah, no problem at all. So he gave him the gun. And off John went. Well, he knew the area really well, and he walked for a mile or so out of the village, across the open land there. Came to a small wooded area, went through the wood. The other side of the wood was a medium-sized lake. And he thought, well, even in the middle of winter when there's ice and snow, the middle of the lake, never freezes over. There's bound to be a duck on there. Well, he looked across and, well, blow me down, there was several duck on there, and he thought, I'm going to be lucky with this. He thought, this is good. As long as I keep my nerve, I'm going to be all right. Well, he got the gun and he rested the butt on the floor and he held the barrel, and he thought, now what is it I do? Gunpowder, and he put some gunpowder in it, wadding, and he got a bit and he just pulled a bit off his shirt and he put that in, and he took the ramrod out and he ramrodded it in, and he put his hand in his pocket to feel his balls, his lead balls, and he got them out and he dropped them in and got the ramrod, while the clitter and the clatter of metal on metal startled the ducks. And he could see the ducks startling. Well, he didn't have time to take the ramrod out, so he just put the gun up to his shoulder and fired it. Well, the kick on the gun, and he wasn't used to it, was so strong, it knocked him over straight on his bum. Well, blow me down, there was a hare underneath him, watching him. And he landed on that hare, broke the hare's neck. And he thought, well, what luck. He thought, well, there's one for the pot already. I'm sure I've got a duck too, he thought. So he got out onto the ice of the lake. It was quite thick on the edges, on the bank. And he began to gingerly walk out and walk across, carefully. And he got closer and closer to where the lake hadn't frozen over. And he could see he'd definitely got a duck. And as he got closer, he thought, oh, I've got more than one duck. Well, what had happened was the ramrod was still in there. He'd fired that out too. Well, the ramrod went across. 5 ducks took off at the same time, and it ping, 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 ping. It went through all 5 ducks, speared them all. And the weight of that on that ramrod took the ramrod down. Well, there was only a trout swimming underneath, going past at that very exact moment, and it speared the trout too. Well, John couldn't believe his luck. He thought, what? 5 ducks and a trout, and I've got a hare back on the bank. This will keep us in food for a week, or possibly even 2, he thought. Oh, can't believe my luck. Well, he picked up the goodies and he turned to go, and the ice cracked, and in he splashed into the water, and he was bobbing around, and he thought, well, don't panic. And he bobbing around, while the ice was so thin around that edge, it was razor sharp, and as he bobbed around, it cut his head completely off. But he didn't panic. The head bobbed underneath the water, and he just put his hand underneath and felt for it, and he got hold of the hair of the head, and he pulled it out, and he put it back on his head, and he got it all in line, and he waited until the frost, because it was so cold, he waited until it froze his head back on his neck, and then he climbed out and he picked up what he had to eat, his trout and his ducks, and he walked back to the bank, and he picked up his hare, and he went back home. Well, when he got back home, the door was bolted, and he knocked on the door, and his wife goes, who's that? He says, me, you silly bugger, let me in. And she unbolted the door, opened the door. Have you got anything? She said. Oh, have I got anything? Look at this, he said. I've got a hare, I've got 5 ducks, and I've got a trout. Marvellous, she said. Absolutely marvellous. She said, right, I'll get on with this right away. She said, you're frizz through, she said. Get those clothes off. She said, get yourself in front of the fire and have a warm. So she went into the kitchen. He sorted himself out. The kids were all scrambling all over his armchair. They were pleased to see Dad back. And he said, go on, get off my chair. And he sat down, and there he is, freezing cold. And he began to warm himself by that lovely fire that he had. He stoked it up a little bit, and he had a lovely warm, and he could feel the chilblains on his fingers beginning to tingle as the warmth came back into his body, and he could feel his bones and his body beginning to warm through as, it was lovely in that fire. It was so warm and cosy, and it got warmer and warmer, and it melted the ice that secured his head, and his head fell off his shoulders, rolled down his lap and across the floor, while it picked up dog hairs, bits of dirt and grit, and heaven knows what else that was lying on that floor as it rolled across. But he didn't panic. Oh, he didn't panic. Really calmly, he said to his wife, get some ice and a tea towel and just pop in here for a moment, would you please? And she got tea towel and some ice, and she went, and she said, what is it, my love? And he said, well, my head's just over there. He said, you wouldn't just pick it up, bring it over here, would you, my love? Of course, she said. And she picked up the head and gave him, and he picked the head up, and he put it back on, and he got everything all in line. He said, right, just wrap the tablecloth with the ice around my neck for me, would you please, my love? And she did. He said, do a tight knot, do a tight knot. And she did. And he said, right. And he waited until it frizz it back on, which it did. Well, the meal that she served that evening, well, they hadn't eaten like that for weeks. They ate like kings. And they ate like kings for many days afterwards with all that wonderful food that he'd got. And more of that story, I don't know. And I've come to the end of my story set, and I won't bow as you clap because I'm afraid that my head might... Thank you. I just want to give a nod with that story because I heard Taffy Thomas tell that at Halsey Manor, and he said that I could have the story. I'm sure he gives most of his stories away, actually. He's a wonderful man, he's Taffy Thomas. And he said, sure, Shane, you can take that story. And I said, it just fits perfect for my family. I'm sure there's some truth of my family in that story. And then about a year later, I was going through a Duncan Williamson book. And at the end, there was a story. I can't remember what it was called now, but it was a version of Fish, Fur and Fowl. So I'm doubly delighted, really, that there's a story that could almost be my family. I got it from Taffy Thomas. I've reread Duncan Williamson's version of it. So for me, it's win-win-win, and it's a wonderful thing. I hope you've enjoyed my stories today. Don't forget, before I go, don't forget there is a virtual hat underneath. If you just scroll down slightly, there's a PayPal hat. If you would like to give a donation, it would be greatly appreciated. Or any of the other storytellers come to that. We are, we've all lost our income, basically. So if you can afford something, lovely. If you can't, please just enjoy the story. Share one of those stories. If you can remember one, please go and share it with someone else. And keep tuning into the World Storytelling Cafe. What a wonderful creation between Mike Wood and John Rowe to create this World Storytelling Cafe, where there are tellers from all across the world coming together virtually, telling stories for the general public to just listen to and absorb, and to do what we did many moons ago. We did it for hundreds and thousands of years. We sat and we told each other stories. And it's something that's still alive, storytelling, and it's growing every year, and perhaps you can help grow this. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Did you enjoy that storyteller? Of course you did. And if you enjoyed it, like the minstrels of old, we're passing around the hat. And if you have some, whether it's paper or coin, our storytellers would appreciate what you put in. Every penny you put in goes directly to that storyteller through paper. All you have to do is go to worldstorytellingcafe.com. Click on today's stories or click on that storyteller, and there'll be a hat below the story. And you can just drop a little in that hat. Well, thank you for listening. And if you can afford it, we'd appreciate it.